Hello everyone, and hello Megan today.
Nice to see you
Nice to see
and
you
to
too.
talk to you again.
Thank you for that, and thank you for accepting this invitation. And welcome everyone in a new episode with Hadith. Today we have Megan. Would you like to introduce yourself to us?
Sure. My name is Megan Kaczanowski. Worked in cybersecurity for about 6 years now. I'm right now the assistant director of security strategy for a financial services company.
That's really
Basically, that
great.
means, yeah, sorry, go
Yeah,
ahead.
sure, you can go. I was going to ask you
Basically,
not to say that. Yeah.
basically, that means that my job is to help folks sort of determine what the best strategy or what the best decisions are to make. Everything from going in and saying, hey, how do we reevaluate a part of our security? For example, data security. We would go in and say, where are we? What do we need to do to be better? Sort of what's our maturity scale? Helping to determine that maturity scale, usually based on like industry research or peers, things like that, and then determining where we fall on that sort of maturity scale, and then figure out what we need to do to get to the next phase and help sort of prioritize work. I think the hard thing for a lot of folks is that you can never be perfectly secure and there's always more work to do. And because of that, it can be kind of hard to determine sort of which controls are the most important to implement or which work is the most important. And so my job is to help folks make those kind of decisions and provide sort of rationale for doing so.
That's really like great work you are doing right now. I'm curious about how did you get like into the work of cybersecurity?
Sure. So I got a degree in economics and political science. Actually, I have a bachelor's degree in economics and political science. And I was working in finance as an analyst, and I didn't like it. Not quite the right fit. But I always really liked playing with computers, like figuring out how things worked and why they worked, and breaking them down. And so around that time, I met a woman who was the head or the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer of a financial services company. And I took the opportunity to just pepper this woman with every question that I'd ever had about security. And I had a lot because I had all these questions about, hey, I think this is really interesting. I don't think I realized when I was in college how big of an industry cybersecurity was, or that there are that many jobs. So I don't think I really realized it was a career field. But when I talked to her and I realized that that was the case, I was able to. She was like, "Well, why don't you do this? You're clearly very interested in it. What are you doing?" And when she found out I was a finance analyst, she was surprised. She was like, "Well, do you want to do this?" And I was like, "Absolutely, that sounds wonderful, but I don't have a degree." She was like, "Well, let me introduce you to some people, and if you can show them that you have like enough technical knowledge, maybe they'll hire you." And someone on her team took a chance on hiring me to work in threat intelligence. Um, so I started working there, and then I've been doing it ever since. I'm very, very grateful. Actually, she and I are now good friends, which is very nice. And she's still a CISO at a different company now, and it's been really a wonderful opportunity. I think there's something really great about having mentors to stand up for you and to sort of help you along your career journey.
Yeah, that's really awesome. Like the story of having your like different background and moving into cybersecurity without like having a degree in computer science. From this point, I would like usually people would like think that they need a degree in computer science or a degree on something like related to engineering. How do you see the field from this like your perspective?
I think that if I could go back, I would get a degree in computer science. I think
Yeah.
it would be very useful. Um, I don't think that you need one. I think that you very much don't. I think to me there are a couple benefits of getting a degree. If you get a degree, it shows sort of in a future employer that you can sort of stick to something for 4 years, which I think can be really helpful, and that you have some base technical skills. Usually, folks who are coming out of computer science degrees are really you're getting a very consistent set of skills that you should. So, I might say, I don't really it doesn't matter what school you come from, a computer science degree should be able to do, X, Y, and Z. So I think it's really helpful for sort of a consistent outlook. If it's not like if it's financially feasible, I think it's often a very good idea. It's gives you a good base of foundations. The first probably 4 or 5 years, and even now in security that I've been working, I spent my weekends and my nights studying, trying desperately to catch up with like a lot of people who had degrees, who had other formal training. And it was tough. I didn't really have a social life. I spent all of my time studying, and I don't regret it. I'm really happy that I am where I am. But if you sort of got the degree up front and then didn't have to spend all of your free time studying, I think that, if you're looking at the choice from the beginning, I wish that I would have liked to have a degree. But all that said, you don't need one. I think there are a lot of really great options, especially in cybersecurity, but even in computer science more generally, to get a job without the degree. As long as you can demonstrate you have the skill set. And I think there are a lot of really great resources, things like Free Code Camp, things like Udemy, or things like online courses released by colleges. They can teach you a lot of those skills. I think the difficulty that you have when is you're sort of trying to set your own syllabus and you're trying to teach yourself your syllabus, which I
Yeah.
think can be tough because it requires a lot of self motivation. And I think that can be really hard. And I think it also requires, like, setting a syllabus is hard, understanding like how
Yeah.
what you need to know. And so it's tough if you're both setting the syllabus for yourself and trying to learn it, and in order to make sure you don't have like gaps in knowledge and things like that. Um, but I think that you very much can learn the information you need to get into a job, or boot camps are a good idea. I think we're seeing more and more of the boot camp idea pop up where they're giving sort of a shortened instruction. So I think that there are a lot of really great options, even if you don't have a degree, to work in the field.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Like, even when you mentioned like free code camp, the thing that I found you through that one of the article that wrote there, and I got really curious, and I was like, she's amazing, and I started to get like to read about that and see what we can do about that. I would like to know about your work. Let's say the article that you are writing on free code camp and the work you are doing outside your like usual job.
The articles really started back when Free Code Camp didn't have their own website and they were publishing
Yeah.
on Medium. So, oh my gosh, it's probably been 4 or 5 years that I've been writing for them. Um, After I'd started working in security for a couple years, so I started out working in threat intelligence, and a lot of threat intelligence is like the idea is basically looking at the external threat landscape and saying, for this company in this industry, what are the threats that we should be worried about? Who are the nation state hackers that we're concerned with? Who are the cybercrime groups that are targeting them? This sort of goes back to what I was saying earlier, where you can't protect against everything. And so if you can figure out which attackers are most likely to target you and what kinds of attacks they're likely to use, then you can help sort of say, okay, well, maybe we should only focus on sort of controls against those types of attacks versus every control in the world, because it's not possible, usually based on usability and budgets and people and time. So you have to pick and choose, and a good way to do that is often to figure out what are the most likely types of attacks. And so a lot of that involves a lot of researching, allows a lot of writing. And I realized that I was running into a lot of people, and as I started working in security, sort of, I realized I was running into a lot of people, even in technical fields, who didn't understand what it was that I did, or why they needed to care about that stuff. And so I started writing more articles about sort of some things about security, because I think honestly, the more folks in technical roles or in non-technical roles who know a little bit about cybersecurity, the better for all of us. We're
Yeah.
all one big, connected, I guess, interface, and the more secure one person is, the more secure we all are. And so that's what sort of started me off writing those things. And then I kept doing it because I think it's really fun. I think Free Code Camp does a really great job. Um, I think they provide a really cool service for folks. It's free, and it's some of the best coding training I've ever seen. Um, and so it's always been a pleasure to write articles for them and content for them.
That's really awesome. Besides Free Code Camp, I know that you have like some different, like, let's say, responsibility outside like that. Like, you started the Women in Cybersecurity in New York.
Yeah,
Uh,
so oops, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, sure, sure.
Yeah.
I was going to ask about that. Yeah.
Um, so I started a Women in Cybersecurity affiliate there's a global Women in Cybersecurity organization It's one of several organizations that are targeted at women in security. But I started a local affiliate in New York in 2019. And I actually am just stepping down as president for this year, which will be exciting to turn it over to some other folks. But for the last 4 years, we've been able to host trainings. And it was sort of, to me, an extension of some of the work I was doing with Free Code Camp, where it was a cool opportunity to be able to create like a community within New York, which was really nice, and to host trainings and webinars and things like that, and help folks get access to trainings that if, a lot of times trainings take place at conferences, and conferences are expensive to the extent that often like it's expected, especially in the United States, that your employer will pay for it. Like the cost might be at, $2,000. And if you're, just trying to get into cybersecurity or into learn something about something technical, you can't afford those. And so we thought, hey, how can we take some of the speakers who are speaking at these conferences, ask them to donate their time to this like community to help people who are maybe newer in their career, things like that, and put on these free trainings. And so that was the goal. And we've been doing that for 4 years now, which is really cool. We actually just hosted a Secure Code Warrior tournament over the end of December, early January, which was a lot of fun.
That's really awesome. Like here, I just remember that in the last podcast when I talked with Brian, we were talking about communities and computer science in general. So he was like mentioning something like computer science is just is a tool like a knife. You don't give someone a knife and tell him that you will be a chef. You need to give him like a restaurant. You need to have like someone who will come to that restaurant and have a whole community. I think that you are doing something like that in the cybersecurity as well. Uh, from this perspective, I would like to ask about how you see that the community that you are building and in cybersecurity is like strong and connected, and how does like it feel for you like being a resident in a community?
Yeah, I think the community is the best part of it for me. I've met some people who have turned into really great friends, and I think the group in cybersecurity isn't particularly big. There aren't that many people who work in cybersecurity yet. Um, and so I think you often see the same people over and over as you start to go to conferences and events and things like that. And it can be really helpful to meet those people. I think a lot of fields are like this, but even more so with security, like people are very motivated to share information. If you find out about a new hack that someone is using, you want to share it with everyone else in your community.
Yeah,
So there are a lot of things called trust groups. And there are ones that are thousands of people, and there are ones that are 10 people on an email list or a Slack channel or something like that. But as you start to enter into security, you start to join these trust groups or be invited to join these trust groups. And a lot of them, some of them are more formal than others. Some of them operate like as organizations. So there's an organization called like the ISACs, or the Information Sharing and Analysis Centers. So for example, my company is part of the financial services one. I've worked at previous companies that were part of, the national defense ones. But basically, they're these organizations that have staff that are literally just designed to help organizations in the same industry share information.
yeah,
And then this is sort of the idea for this came from these like small informal groups where like it turned out as a group of people who knew each other, who were willing to share information, who were sort of going to the restaurant and doing things like that. And those communities are so important. Both important for like me personally, as far as it's been great to have, mentors and support and be able to mentor other folks in those kind of relationships. But also in a very practical job related sense, it's where people share information about like tactics, techniques, and procedures that we're seeing, adversaries use.
yeah,
So we're sharing, often people share that information in those groups so that other people in the group can leverage it to improve their defenses. As I was saying earlier, like it's a matter of the more secure one organization is, the more secure all the organizations is. So there's a really high benefit to like sharing that kind of information, to getting attacked and then showing someone else how it worked so that they won't get attacked in the same way.
yeah,
I think that's a really cool part of this community, because it could very easily be a case where everyone is like, no, I don't want to admit that I was, compromised, and I don't want to share any information about the attack. But for the most part, people are really good about sharing that, because they understand how hard it can be to do defense.
yeah,
I think the thing you remember about defending in cyber attacks is that if, as a defender, you have to be successful every single time. And as an attacker, you only have to be successful once.
yeah.
So it's a tough job. And I think it's really cool to see the community sort of build up around that.
That's really awesome. Like, since you are mentioning the defender and attacker right now, the thing that I get curious about, or I would like to listen to you about, is like there is in cybersecurity. It's not just like I think it's a big field and a big scene, and there is a lot of like let's say specialty inside that as well. And during like in such communities, you have like a lot of people from different specialties. So, can you give us some kind of information about this kind of specialties inside cybersecurity?
Sure. So yeah, it is a pretty wide sort of gap. I think there are a couple of big buckets. You see, usually see sort of like incident response and threat intelligence, and what I'm going to call cyber defense is one big bucket. And those are the blue teamers or the defenders. Those
Yeah,
are people who are saying, there's someone who's actively in our network. We are going to respond to that, and we're going to figure out how to improve our defenses for next time. But they're mostly like a response team. You want to think of them almost as like the SWAT,
yeah,
or if you've seen, American TV shows, it's basically like the special police unit. They're going to hunt down the attackers. Then you have the sort of the opposite. You have the red team, which are the people who, and red team are basically folks who are employed full time by an organization to try to penetrate the systems. They're penetration testers, but they work for the organization full time. And then they'll often work with the blue team to sort of do an attack, and then the blue team will try to defend it. And then you'll see sort of them learning from each other. So these are the two sides I think that most people think of when they think of cybersecurity, which is like the defenders and then the attackers. Um, and that those can both be split up into like lots of different groups. So, as a red teamer, you might specialize in different things and like different types of attacks. As a blue teamer, you might specialize in something like threat intelligence, where you're maybe doing more like research on the attackers. Whereas, if you're a strict defender, you might be doing more like almost network engineering, like trying to dig through the network. And then you have things like threat hunting, which is like where you're going out and trying to figure out if someone is in your network. So there are some subfields within those, but those are two big groups. And then you often have sort of a risk section of the organization too, that sort of quantifies for the organization what the risk is of a cyber attack. And that's not a very technical role typically, but it's technical enough that you have to understand this, and you're helping the business to understand, what the consequences are if something goes wrong, and help them to understand, why they have to put certain controls in place, things like that. And sort of decide what the most dangerous risks are. So that's sort of a section as well. And then you have, identity and access management in some organizations is under security and some organizations is not. But that's obviously like a core tenet of security. Anyone who's doing anything with identity and access management is a pretty big function. Um, and then you have folks like me, which are what I call security architecture. And so those are folks who are trying to work with, application teams and development teams or enterprise architecture teams, trying to make sure that when you build software, you build it securely from the start, helping to develop, architectural patterns, things like that, to say, how is it that we can build this more securely? I hate to use too many buzzwords, but basically, can we shift the security left in the process? So they're really engaging people when they have the idea to build something, not when it's already built. It's obviously much harder to add security on after someone's already built an application than if you can get in from the beginning and you can, sort of put security at every layer as you're designing it.
yeah,
And then, oops, sorry, go ahead.
yeah. Go ahead.
Uh, and then there are a couple other sort of sections. There are folks who work, there are there are like security vendors who provide specific tool sets to security teams. And so there you see a lot of like security engineers who are really just engineers who are working on security tooling with a heavy focus on security, things like that. And then you'll have folks, in leadership, things like that. Like a CISO is the head of an organization. I think that's kind of a really broad overview, but sort of depending on the organization and how they determine security, you can see a lot of other things.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think the most like you already mentioned that on that people get mostly attracted to the red teams and they move there and they are not aware of the other teams, or let's say they don't know about what kind of work they can do there. So what could you suggest like or give an advice for such people?
I think red teaming is really, really cool. I think only caveat is that red teaming is a pretty small percentage of like most jobs, or at least not of jobs, but of really of the industry as a whole. Red teaming is a pretty small percentage. You don't need that many red teamers typically. And so I'd say that, and so you can either work for a company, but then it has to be a big enough company to have a dedicated red team. Usually think the big tech companies, big finance companies, things like that. So those are places to look for red team jobs. And other places, there are a lot of consulting companies that either specialize in penetration testing or do other kind of consulting and also do penetration testing. And those are good places to look for sort of your first penetration testing job, is because then you'll see if you can get a job as a penetration tester for one of these big consulting firms, you'll go from to like many different companies and penetration test sort of all of them. And so you'll see a lot more than you would in just sort of one company. It's sort of a little bit of a so that's a sort of a good place to start. If you're looking for sort of some place to start studying to be a penetration tester, I'd say there's a lot of free resources. HackerOne has a Hacker 101 course on web security that's free. That's pretty cool. That introduces you to sort of the idea of bug bounties. And bug bounties are a good way. I think if you don't have any experience, a good way to get experience is either by participating in bug bounties and showing that, or participating in capture the flag tournaments. And those can also be sort of a good way to show off your skills if you don't have job experience doing it. And if you're looking to sort of get into it, Free Code Camp has some great resources. SANS has a holiday hack challenge that they do every December. SANS is probably the gold standard for security training. So they have some CTFs they put on that there are like a good place to get started. And then sort of figuring out some of the bigger tools, things like Burp Suite. They have a community edition that's free, figuring out how to use Kali Linux, pretty in depth. So starting to learn how to use those tools, I think, is a really good place to start. And then really looking for a job, because the more you can learn on the job, the sort of easier your life will be.
Yeah. Is it hard, like, for someone to get like a job in cybersecurity who has like participated in bug bounty programs and capture the flag, or how can they like get something into that?
I think it really depends on the job they're looking for. Some jobs are going to be harder than others. Like to become
Yeah.
a penetration testers in many cases is harder than, just because there are less of those jobs. I think that what I usually advise people to do is to sort of look at what kind of skills they have either from previous jobs, or if you're coming from university, it's a little easier, I think, because then you sort of know what the entry level jobs are. But if you're coming from a different field, sort of saying, hey, here are the transferable skills I have. Like these are the things that were useful in my last job that could be useful in a new job. And then figuring out sort of what field in security is the best to get into. I'd say honestly, like taking any job in security is probably a good start, because once you're in a security team, even if it's not quite the team you want to be in, it's much easier to move between teams than it is, to get exactly the right job in the first place. And so I think that, and also I think it can be really useful to see like different parts of security. I think a lot of the folks I know have moved around a little bit, before they've decided to specialize, just so they got a little bit of a sense of what other teams were doing, and I think that can be really helpful, because the better you understand what it is that your teammates are trying to do, the more you can help them.
Uh, since you mentioned like someone that a lot of people have like moved until they specialize, so uh, what is the best time for someone to say that this is the thing that I would specialize in that? How can
Um,
they determine that? I think it's
yeah.
like more a personal question, but like I would like to get some of your perspective of that.
Yeah, I think it is somewhat of a personal question. I think a lot of it is once you're sure, if that makes sense. I think that sometimes I always feel like it takes me about a year to get a good sense of the job that I'm doing. Um, and I think you don't really start to understand some of the more in-depth aspects of the job until you've been there for a little while. And I think that it's something where you kind of know. It's I think I mentioned this earlier, where you spend a lot of free time studying. Outside of this, I think any job in tech is going to make you study outside of work. um,
Yeah.
And security, the same thing. Anytime a developer comes in and says, hey, I want to use this new tool or this new framework or this new language, now all of a sudden you have to make a decision about whether or not, what the risk is of that, of doing so. Are there vulnerabilities? Do you have concerns? Are there mitigating controls you need to put in place? And so you're sort of constantly studying. And I think once you find sort of the specialization where you're excited to be constantly studying, that's really the sort of way it is to specialize, or at least that was for me. I think when you realize you're like excited to do the sort of work you're doing, even when it's not at work, I think that's kind of kind of nice when you're still excited about the technology and whatnot. So I think it's really about, if you can, finding a passion. I think that can be really helpful, and it can make your life a lot more pleasant if you really enjoy what you're doing.
That's really awesome. I think like the issue here is like finding the passion of like someone passionate. It's like sometimes people just struggle to find that, and they try different fields and they are not sure about that. Even for you, I think you started in, as you mentioned, like in different degree, and then you moved to cybersecurity.
Yeah.
Awesome. How you see like the future of cybersecurity right now from your like perspective, since you are working in the field itself?
I think we'll still see a lot of growth. I think we're still seeing a lot of growth right now. I think that the attacks are getting worse, not better. We're seeing, I think in the early days of sort of security, we saw a lot of attacks by individuals. And then we started to see nation states get into it. And then we started to see sort of gangs get into it. And now we see a lot of organized gangs, which I think is very interesting, because now you sort of have these groups that operate very much like organizations. There's someone who's in charge. There are people who specialize in network penetration. There are people who specialize in like writing custom malware. Sometimes you'll even have someone who like specializes in finance, who can look at the balance sheets of the company and determine how much they can afford to pay, which is actually honestly really interesting from an economics
Yeah.
perspective. You're seeing true price differentiation in a way that really doesn't exist anywhere else. And then you'll often have someone else, they'll have folks who are like dedicated customer support, so they can help people. Often the ransoms are paid in various cryptocurrencies, so they'll help the organization buy cryptocurrency in order to pay the ransom. So you see like a very high degree of specialization with these gangs, and you're seeing more of them. And it's what's referred to as the rise of big game hunting. And it's really the idea that now that these organizations, because they're like larger organizations, they're not looking for a $200 payday from 6 grandmas, which I think was a lot of the case in the 90s, where people were, or even in the early 2000s, we saw a lot of cyber criminals who were acting alone and who were targeting like people who are older, people who weren't as tech savvy, like a lot of consumers and a
Yeah.
lot of individuals. And now with this big game hunting, you have these gangs where like that kind of payout isn't going to cut it. So they're going to spend months targeting a specific entity until they can get them to pay out. And they're going to be looking for a payout of millions of dollars. And that's been really interesting. I think that's going to get worse, not better, because they've shown it that it's been successful, and because it's really, really hard, as a defender, to secure everything. And if there's a really competent attacker who has months to dedicate to just attacking you, and they have a lot of resources, it's really hard to entirely avoid getting attacked, or getting breached. And so I think that we'll continue to see these tactics leveraged. I think we'll continue to see these groups exist. It's really big business at this point. I'm pretty sure it became more profitable than the drug trade in like 2017. So it's good money. And often in these cases where you're seeing cyber criminals operate, there's nothing the local law enforcement can do. I think attribution is really, really hard in cybersecurity. We've seen that a lot with different nation state attacks in the news, but in general, it's really hard to sort of say definitively that this attack came from these people. And so that's the first problem. And even if you can do that, if those, the people who are carrying out the attack are in a country that is unfriendly to those in whom they're attacking, then the law enforcement might not work together, meaning that they're not going to be able to take down some of these gangs. And so they often deal with sort of a high level of immunity. Or just that if they're stealing sort of enough, but not so much that they, trigger the attention of like international law enforcement, they can get away with it for years. And so I think that combination means that we'll continue to see a lot of these attacks. It seems unlikely that those will go away. I think the other thing that we've seen more and more of are increasingly what's the word, advanced attacks by groups like nation states. So Stuxnet was like one of the first cyber warfare weapons. I want to say like 2010. It was like the US and Israel created a computer worm that targeted an Iranian nuclear facility and caused centrifuges that enrich uranium to spin so fast that they would explode, but only at random times. So it was really hard to detect that it was sabotage.
Yeah.
And since then, we've seen, cyber attacks from almost every major country in the world. And I think what's tough about those is that the people who work for these teams are people who look very much like me, right? They have a 9 to 5. They go in and they're very well trained and they're very well funded, and their job is to just target organizations that are not that are in line with their country's goals. I think that we're likely to see more of those attacks. I think it's a really interesting sort of space because you have countries targeted. The country is sort of targeted both. We're trying to both attack other countries but also defend their own. So for example, in the US, there are teams that are dedicated to offensive hacking of other countries, and there are teams that are sort of tasked with defending their own organizations. But it's really hard because, one, this is the internet, and two, everyone's using the same software. So if you find a vulnerability in like Microsoft software, for example, well, what are you going to do with that? Are you going to leverage it and exploit it with your offensive team, or are you going to tell everyone in your company or in your country to patch it and sort of protect them? And so I think that's a really interesting dichotomy, which is you have like the same organization basically tasked with opposite goals. And so that's really interesting to see how that's going to play out and to see how countries are going to deal with that and how that sort of evolves. Because the other thing is, like, when these attacks get out of control, there's just nothing you can do about it. I don't know if you remember the WannaCry
Yeah.
incident. Yeah, it wasn't
The
intended.
ransomware.
Yeah, sorry. So ransomware is basically, if anyone doesn't know, it's basically when a piece of malware attacks your device and it like encrypts all of your files unless you pay a ransom. And in this case, even if you paid the ransom, nothing happened. In fact, the ransom payment was broken. You could just pay ransom all day and nothing would happen. And it spread out of control. It did billions of dollars of damage. It shut down the NHS in the UK. And I think that's the other problem, is that once you release these attacks, you don't really have any control over what happens to them or where they spread. It's like a biological virus. Viruses online work the same way. So I think that's really interesting. I don't know exactly where we'll go with that, but I think we're going to continue to see a lot of attacks by nation states. It's a useful tool. It's not going away anytime soon. And I think that those will continue to get better. And I think that those two things will mean that the market for cybersecurity jobs will continue to grow. I think at some point we'll probably hit a place where we'll start to automate some of the jobs. I think that there's still a lot of room for growth before we hit that point. I think that we'll eventually see either more cybersecurity training looked at for like IT professionals for like, let's say, local schools and like smaller government agencies. A lot of places that don't right now like hire anyone in cybersecurity. I think we'll start to see folks doing that, where like a school might have to have like an IT technician who also, knows something about security to help protect students and things like that. Or, smaller local government agencies around the world in different municipalities starting to hire more cybersecurity people. We've seen a lot of attacks on these sort of groups, on like schools and small municipalities, largely because their defenses aren't very good. And so I think that it'll become the case where we'll have to see more jobs growing there. I think that'll be really interesting. So I definitely think there's still more growth in the industry before it sort of condenses. And so I think it's an exciting time to be there. There's a lot to be done. And it's also, I think, in a lot of ways, kind of a tough job because there's a lot to be done, but also there's a limit to how much can be done. I think a lot of the protocols that we use are kind of inherently insecure. The internet wasn't designed to be secure in a lot of ways. And so a lot of the things that we do now are sort of the analogy I like to use is it feels like when you're in an organization, you're building like a really, really powerful car, but there are no rules of the road. And in
Yeah.
fact, there's no road. So you're just driving your like very well armored car across like a Mad Max type desert. Um, and you're hoping that some people are adhering to the rules. But there aren't really any. And so I think that's sort of an odd space to be. You can do a lot to secure your organization, but there's a limit to what you can do when you're working with protocols that weren't designed to be secure. Um, and when there's a lot of like old tech that exists and a lot of people that sort of aren't it isn't a priority for them to update it.
Yeah. Since you are mentioning the infrastructure, or let's say the protocols that we are using right now, I honestly I read something about like we have already vulnerability in those protocols, and updating these vulnerabilities is like would cost much more than keeping them.
Yeah.
S- So you have like a financial side about that, or economical side that people wouldn't like to update that because of like it wouldn't like make sense for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the case for everything too, you know, like everything is really just goes down to like do you have the time and the money and the people to do it? And you have to make choices about how you spend those things. So in many cases, you know, a lot of things don't get updated.
Yeah.
Which and
And
I'm not saying that that's the wrong ever the wrong decision. I think that like, you know, my job as a security team is never to say like, "Hey, you can't do this, it's insecure." My job is always to go in and say, "Here's the risks if we do that." And if you're okay with that risk, you know, that's great, but like let's just make sure that everyone is well informed about what the risk is, and that we all have the same idea of what this looks like before we go into the decision. I think that's, you know, really a security team's job is to make sure that everyone's aware of all the consequences of the decision they're making, and if they are, great.
yeah, that's really awesome. Like, since you are mentioning the awareness, is it like, should everyone be aware of the security from your side, and how you think that what is the limit of awareness for, like, let's say, public people?
I think that it would be great if everyone had some level of sort of security awareness. I think it can be really, really helpful, you know, especially as an individual. I give people this speech a lot, even though I think there are less sort of targeted attacks at individuals. It's a really good idea for everyone to be generally aware of like how to protect themselves online, you know, things like using a password manager, and having strong unique passwords for accounts. I think the speech I get a lot from folks is, you know, oh, no one would ever attack me, and they, you know, don't think about the fact that there are plenty of people who have no desire to attack you specifically, but are just sort of like randomly scanning the internet for anyone who they found, or they, you know, they find an old password and, you know, old set of credentials like your username and password in an old data breach, and then they just take that and they plug it into a tool that goes across and tries that password in every other site. So if you use the same password for your bank account as like, you know, some app that got hacked sometime, now this criminal has access to your bank account because the first app was insecure, not because of anything directly that you did. And so I think things like that are really important. Like everyone should have a general idea of, you know, how to be secure online. But I also think within an organization it can be really helpful. Like I think everyone should have a general idea, and I think that folks who work in technology functions, it's, you know, generally helpful when they have an even better idea, especially in, I think with security you work most closely with folks like developers and who folks who build infrastructure, network engineers, things like that. And those folks, I think it's really important that they have a more specific idea of security, because it makes a lot of these things easier, right? Ideally, you know, you have a team that works really well together and everyone understands the risks, and it's just a matter of figuring out how to prioritize things effectively. But it's always easier to go into a conversation where everyone has sort of the same idea of what the risks are, and what can go wrong. You know, I think it's a matter of, you know, if good engineering is a matter of thinking like how can this system fail, like security is sort of the same thing. It's
Yeah.
thinking about how will someone misuse this, how will someone attack this, you know, what could happen to this that it could fail, you know, what happens if we overload this, what happens if we put in input that was unexpected, what does that look like, and how do we deal with the consequences. And so I think, you know, the more sort of everyone in the organization is thinking like that, you know, thinking how can this system be misused, and how would it react if it were, the better we're off we all are.
Yeah, that's really awesome. Like, since you are mentioning the people and how they need to be aware on cybersecurity in some level or security in some level, like some of people would think that, okay, what would happen if they hack me? So like I don't have much of important information or sensitive information, and from the other side, other people would say like even if you use like a passport manager, like I think the last pass they get hacked or get some kind of breach like a few weeks ago. So how would we see the things from these two perspectives? One of them like is like, let's say, too nosy and they wouldn't care about information, and the other like would say even if we care about them, we will get hacked whatever we do.
Yeah. Well, okay. So I'll first touch on the last pass. And
Yeah,
full disclosure, I don't have any inside information. All I have is what they've released publicly. But what, based on what LastPass has said publicly, is that while someone was able to access the customer vault, the only thing that the attackers were able to get were like encrypted password files. So the usernames and passwords were encrypted, which means that unless the passwords were extremely simple, and even if they were, it'd be pretty unlikely that an attacker would be able to see the plain text password. So, generally speaking, it seems like your information is probably going to be okay as long as you created strong, unique passwords in your password manager. And they prompt you to sort of do that. And so I wouldn't overly panic about that. I have heard a lot of like, oh, we should never use a password manager because of that. Um, but it doesn't really seem like, based on this attack or other attacks, and that's not to say that it couldn't happen. It could definitely be the case in the future that one of these password managers get breached. But in this case, it looks like all they were able to get was the encrypted information, which means that the encryptions we use, like industry standard encryption at this point, are really hard to break and almost impossible to reverse with current technology. If we ever really have true quantum computing, that will be a different case, but we're not there
yeah,
yet. And so, assuming that they can't break that encryption, it's really okay. And I would still say that a password manager is better than you doing it yourself, because I think the thing is that there are a couple of things. If something is hard to use, people don't use it. Like I won't use it. You know what I mean? And if you have to set up like a new password every time you set up a new account and you have to remember it, like eventually you're going to come up with a system that is like the same password or parts of the same password over and over again. Or, because people are lazy. Like I'm lazy. No one wants to come up with like strong, unique passwords for every time you have to sign up for like a one-off delivery app because you wanted, a discount code on some website you're shopping on. And so I think the password managers are good because they make good security convenient. I use 1Password, but LastPass, is also fine. Or there are other password managers, and they often come with like a phone app and a browser extension and like a desktop extension. And so it's a matter of, using your fingerprint or using, depending on what kind of device you have, or like a Face ID or something like that, to fill in all of your password information and save it. So it makes like remembering strong, unique passwords and setting strong, unique passwords super easy. And I'm a big fan of things that make things a little more usable because they're more likely to use it. The strongest system in the world, if you don't use it, is useless. But a pretty secure system, if you use it consistently, is a very good thing. And so I think password managers are really great because they make it easy to do. Even like my parents who are much older, I've made them use a password manager. And it's really great because now they actually use it. And it's user friendly to them. And I no longer have to worry about them using the same password or not very
yeah,
secure passwords. So I still think it's a very good idea as far as like using it. I think it makes things a little usable. And I think, honestly, the second best option, which is like, well, honestly, I think that, those like password, but if you just write all of your passwords down, I know people say writing your passwords down, but the chances of someone breaking into your house and then stealing your book of passwords would be a very, very targeted attack and seems very, very unlikely for most people. If you're the CEO of a company, maybe don't do that.
yeah,
But for most people, your grandparents, your parents, write your passwords down. And then maybe, but even then you have to then have the password book with you. And if you're like need to log into an account somewhere else and you have to go find all the passwords, not so great. And much better than, writing it down in like a notes app or something like that is entirely unsecured. So even though there have been some incidents, I also think that companies like password managers, like their whole job is security. Marriott hotels got breached a couple years ago, and like people are still going to their hotels. I'm not going to stay at a Marriott hotel because like they've got great security. I'm going because they've got a nice hotel chain. And so even though, they leaked all of my data and everyone else's a couple years ago, people are still going to stay there. But password managers, like their whole job is security. If they were to lose all the information, they're going to go out of business. And they also don't have the other things that they're spending money on. So typically they're hiring pretty big security teams, and they're hiring engineers that are solely focused on that. Again, I don't think it's a perfect solution. I think that we'll continue to see more attacks on password managers. I think the disadvantage of more people using them means that there are now more attacks that are targeting them, and that's only going to get worse. And so, as we continue to see things progress, I think we'll probably see more attacks on password managers. Maybe the password managers will get bigger and more institutionalized. Maybe we'll see something else. So I do think that there is a lot of sort of traction that's going to happen there. But as of right now, I still think that using a password manager is typically better than not using one. And then the first part of your question, I sort of answered the second part first, which is that, like, why would someone hack me? I think, again, it's really important to say that very rarely are you being targeted as an individual, unless you have, maybe if you have like cryptocurrency accounts or something like that. But for the most part, I think it's more of attackers are looking for anyone who has like something free. So typically what you'll see, the most common sort of attack when people get hacked is really like, oh, there was a data breach and my information was included in the data breach. And then I took those credentials and then I just plugged them into basically a scanner, and I plugged those credentials into every other website, on the planet. And then I happened to get into your account because you reused the same password, or you reused part of the same password, because if I have part of the password, it's easier to crack the rest of the password. So I think it's much more common that things like that happen than anything else, or that, one of those data breaches included your credit card information and stuff like that. And so I think that the thing that's important to remember about that is that could be bad for a number of reasons. One, like, I think I hear people say this a lot, which is that, like, oh, I don't have anything to hide. And I think that it's one thing, there's a difference between like privacy and having something to hide. Just because I don't have anything to hide, I'm still going to, close my windows when I'm changing, or close doors if I want to have a private conversation with someone. The same way, like, just because I don't really have anything to hide doesn't mean I want every single text message I've ever sent to be like dumped online, or every single email dumped online or something like that. There are things that you tell some people and not others. And I think that so there's always a reason for privacy. I think that's the first thing, is just because you don't have anything to hide, it can still be a good idea to protect your data. And I think the other thing is that identity theft is hard to recover from in most places. Once someone's stolen your identity, it's really hard to get it back. And a lot of the things that we're now using in the digital world to sort of serve as our identity are things like email addresses and phone numbers. And so if your phone number gets lost, or your email address, you lose control of it, someone else can impersonate you really well. And then they can and then sometimes, if they have access to your email address, they might send scammy letters to, family and friends asking for money. And some of those folks might pay it. Things like that, or even just, if someone can get into your bank account and drain your bank account, that's not great. Or access, other especially cryptocurrency accounts, because cryptocurrency accounts, like, once that money's gone, it's almost impossible to recover it. So those are a big one. But honestly, I think that it can be really devastating even for a small thing to happen. And I think sometimes we underestimate how bad it will be, or how scary it will be to feel like we're being targeted. And so I think that it's not that everyone has to be, extremely, extremely secure, but instead, I think it's a matter of saying like, oh, yeah, I might say, oh, I don't have anything to steal, but I'm still going to lock my door when I leave my house. I think, using a password manager, things like that, it's the equivalent of like locking your door when you leave your house, or like locking your bike up when you bike to school, or things like that. I think in 5 or 10 years, we'll really think of these as like foundational cybersecurity things,
Yeah.
where it'll be as required as like locking up your car, or stuff like that. And so I think maybe it's nice to start thinking of digital security and digital privacy in the same way we think of in-person security and in-person privacy.
That's a really good point. Like, because people usually, like, treating the online and digital stuff like different than the thing that we see in our life, because we don't like sense them, and we don't have like a direct touch on that. It's like, even on, if you think about it in money, like, you pay more with the credit card, and you spend more with the credit card than you spend in like normal cash. So it's like a different
Yeah.
perspective from that. From here, I get like curious about, you mentioned the quantum computing and how that would change the world and change our perspective on the security right now. and you even mentioned that the protocols that we are using here. I get a question about the future. So in the future, like we might have autonomous cars, we might have drones, we might have like even quantum computing, and we have all like this attractive stuff. Like how we will see the cybersecurity in this area in in the future.
I think quantum computing will be a big change because it'll require us to write, like we're already seeing folks write what we call we're trying to develop post quantum cryptography.
Yeah.
Because that'll be the big thing is that quantum computing will mean that the encryption, real quantum computing that exists and is like cheaply and freely available will mean that the encryption we have been using for many years really is easily breakable. Most of our encryption methods are basically based on the fact of like how long it would take with given current computing methods to break it would be unsustainable. But if we were able to make that jump to quantum, all of a sudden all of that goes out the window and we have to develop entirely new encryption algorithms, and anything that was in the past encrypted with sort of weaker encryption algorithms will be useless. And so I
Yeah.
think that'll be a really interesting shift, and that'll be interesting to see how we evolve. Um, I don't think that will be a big change in like the industry as a whole. I think we'll be changing the encryption methods, but we'll still have, encryption. We'll still have, people who are trying to crack encryption, things like that. So I think it'll be very similar, just with like more advanced tech. As
Yeah.
far as like the drones and the autonomous cars, I think a lot of those will start to fundamentally change the way we think about cyber. Because, I think we've all seen the vision of like having a city full of autonomous cars where like the streets and the cars and everyone and the lights, like everyone is basically on the same network and is communicating their location to other parties. That's super, super cool. And I really hope that that happens. From a cybersecurity perspective, that scares me too, because,
Yeah.
flaws in those systems can result in real quantifiable damage. And that's something I think really interesting is the crossover between sort of as we were talking about now is like, credit and debit cards, or like physical and
Yeah.
digital security, or, and, what's that crossover? I think that crossover becomes really real when we're talking about tech that exists in people's lives. Things like cars and drones, like those being sort of hacked, is hugely dangerous for people as a whole. And I think that's something that right now we really only see the capacity to do for like nation states. So there are like plenty of cars that are able to be hacked, but most of the time those hacks have been you need to be local to the car. And so they're very targeted attacks. Um, and so targeted attacks are usually only the sort of wherewithal of nation states, just because like you have to be able to send someone close enough to hack a car, and you're only going to do that for a very sensitive target, things like that. Where they were a lot of attacks that are very interesting but not practical for a lot of people. But if it became the case that everyone had an autonomous car that there had the capacity to be hacked, and there was some kind of vulnerability in one of the car's software or something like that, and it were connected to some kind of network, and someone could get onto that network, all of a sudden, the danger level is raised, and this now becomes a dangerous thing for your average person, not just for like very high net worth individuals. And so I think that will fundamentally change the industry, because I think we'll need a lot more security, and we'll need to be a lot more sure about the security of our networks, because we'll be putting people's lives at risk if we're not. And the same thing with drones. Like if we see non-nation states and like other sort of groups or individuals who are able to compromise drones and then leverage them in attacks, again, that's sort of it's putting people's lives in danger potentially. And so I think it's really cool to see the more and more things we're putting online, but also I think sometimes we put things online without thinking about them.
Yeah.
We're already seeing this a little bit with like chemical plants or power plants. A lot of them are really good with security, and a lot of them, you know, this is sort of it's just a side note, but like ICS components or industrial control systems, like in many cases are built very differently than like operational technology. So when you have like industrial control systems and they're vulnerable, and they're vulnerable in different ways, and those things are now online, it just raises all kinds of additional sort of questions about how do we secure those, and what's the risk if we don't.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and like it's really cool as you mentioned, and it's really scary at the same time. Uh, I'm not sure how someone could like how we can imagine the future right now. At the end of this episode, I would like to ask you for like, do you have any advice for people and folks who want to get into cybersecurity? Um, what would you suggest them to do?
The big one is stay curious. If you see something you don't understand, Google it. And then if in that explanation you see something else that you don't understand, Google that. And sort of following that wormhole, I think is the best way that I've ever learned, and the best way that some of the smartest people I know have learned, which is really just to be curious and to continue learning until you understand the things that you don't, because that's really all security is understanding how things work at a really deep level, so you can understand how they can be misused, and how you can protect from that misuse.
That's a great advice. Thank you for your time and thank you for all the talk and the information that you shared with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for that again, and thank you for the audience today. And hope to see you in the future episode. And we'll see you later. Have a great time.